Edward Harrington's day had started like any other, a blur of meetings, decisions, and responsibilities stacked higher than the towers of Westhaven. As the heir to the Harrington Hotel empire, Edward was accustomed to a life where every problem could be fixed by signing a check or making a phone call. He navigated through the gleaming city streets in his luxury sedan, his mind buried deep in thought about tomorrow's crucial board meeting. It was his chance to prove to his father and himself that he was ready to lead. But fate had other plans. Distracted by the weight of his thoughts, Edward made a wrong turn down an unfamiliar street. Before he could correct his error, the shadows seemed to peel from the walls around him, surrounding his car. Within moments, masked figures emerged, swift, precise, and terrifyingly efficient. His door was flung open, and Edward found himself thrust out onto the cold pavement, heart pounding, palms raised in surrender. Minutes later, the street was deserted again. Edward stood alone under the flickering glow of a distant street lamp. No phone, no wallet, no car. Just silence and the cool whisper of the night breeze, echoing the unfamiliarity of his newfound helplessness. For the first time in his carefully curated life, Edward Harrington was utterly powerless. He sighed deeply and began walking, the soles of his designer shoes clicking awkwardly on cracked pavement. His pulse gradually slowed as he reached a more populated avenue, though a new reality settled heavily upon him. Without his phone or wallet, he couldn't call for help or summon a driver. Reluctantly, Edward realized he had only one option: the bus. A few blocks away, Sophie Carter waited tiredly at her usual bus stop. Her day at Rosie's diner had stretched painfully long, her feet aching from serving countless cups of coffee and hot plates of food. She dug into her apron pocket, carefully counting her few remaining coins. It was enough, barely, to get home. Sophie sighed with quiet relief as headlights flashed, signaling the arrival of the bus. She stepped onto the bus, depositing her last coins into the driver's open hand, and settled into a window seat, letting her eyes drift shut briefly, but her rest was short-lived. "I already told you, sir. No money, no ride." The driver's voice carried sharply through the otherwise quiet bus, jolting Sophie awake. She turned toward the commotion, watching with quiet interest as a clearly distressed man stood pleadingly at the entrance of the bus. His clothes, though expensive, were rumpled, his expression frustrated, embarrassed, and helpless. "I was robbed." Edward's voice was strained, barely above a whisper. "My car, wallet, phone, everything. Please, I just need to get home." The driver shook his head, unmoved. "Heard that one before, buddy. Rules are rules." Edward stood motionless, his pride fracturing under the uncomfortable gaze of strangers. He felt the sting of humiliation, a billionaire reduced to pleading for bus fare. And then, a voice cut through the thick silence. "I'll pay for his fare," Sophie spoke clearly, standing up as she moved towards the front. The bus fell quiet, dozens of eyes now fixed on the young woman who had barely enough to pay her own way. Edward looked up sharply, startled. He hadn't expected help, least of all from a stranger. Sophie met his gaze, offering a simple, genuine smile as she handed her coins to the driver. "You don't have to do this," Edward murmured, discomfort evident in his expression. "I already did," Sophie replied softly, nodding towards the vacant seat behind her. "Better sit down before he changes his mind." Wordlessly, Edward took a seat, the shame burning through him slowly giving way to a curious gratitude. He had spent his life surrounded by wealth and privilege, accustomed to favors that came with hidden agendas. But this woman, this stranger, had offered help expecting nothing in return. He glanced subtly back towards her. Sophie had returned to her seat, leaning tiredly against the glass, eyes fixed thoughtfully on the passing lights of Westhaven. Edward found himself captivated, not just by her simple generosity, but by the quiet strength he sensed within her. The bus rumbled steadily along, and when it slowed at Sophie's stop, Edward felt an unexpected sense of urgency. "Hey," he called softly as Sophie rose from her seat. She paused, turning with mild curiosity in her eyes. I just wanted to thank you. You have no idea how much you helped me tonight, Edward said sincerely. Sophie's lips curled into a gentle smile. Everyone needs a little help sometimes, she replied quietly. Before Edward could say anything more, she stepped off the bus and disappeared into the cool Westhaven night. Edward sat quietly as the bus doors hissed shut, feeling strangely unsettled. The remainder of his journey home was consumed with thoughts of the woman whose name he did not even know, whose kindness had pierced through the cold veil of his privileged world. Arriving finally downtown, Edward walked toward the towering glass structure he called home. The doorman's eyes widened slightly as Edward approached. "Mr. Harrington? Is everything all right?" Edward managed a weak smile. "Just had a rough night, Tom. Can you let me in?" Tom nodded slowly, clearly confused but professionally silent. Edward stepped into his expansive penthouse, collapsing onto the leather couch. Yet despite the luxury surrounding him, he felt oddly empty. His mind drifted back to Sophie, the gentle stranger who had so effortlessly changed his night, and perhaps something deeper within him. Across town, Sophie unlocked the door to her modest home. Exhausted, she slipped inside quietly, careful not to disturb her sleeping mother. She prepared for bed with thoughts not of Edward but of the familiar comforts of rest. To her, tonight's act of kindness was nothing extraordinary, simply human. But unbeknownst to her, she had profoundly altered the life of Edward Harrington. As dawn crept gently over Westhaven, Edward awoke with a singular thought dominating his mind. He needed to find that woman again. He didn't understand why. He only knew that he had to see her, had to thank her properly, had to understand what it was that drew him so powerfully to a woman he barely knew. With new resolve, Edward prepared quickly. Passing through the lobby, he paused before Tom. "Tom, I need your help," Edward began firmly. "Of course, sir," Tom replied dutifully. "I need to locate a diner, one that employs waitresses wearing blue uniforms. It should be along the bus route near downtown." Tom nodded immediately. "Consider it done, Mr. Harrington." Edward thanked him, stepping out onto the bustling city street. He felt strangely alive, invigorated by the unknown challenge before him. For once, Edward Harrington had no script, no expectations, just the urge to follow wherever this new path might lead. Little did he know, this impulsive decision would soon alter not just his own future, but Sophie Carter's as well. Edward stood outside the modest entrance of Rosie's diner, the quiet hum of the neon sign mixing gently with the soft patter of rain against the pavement. He had rarely ventured into establishments like this, his life carefully curated around five-star restaurants and exclusive lounges. Yet something about this place felt right, almost inviting in its simplicity. He took a deep breath, feeling an unusual tightness in his chest, and stepped inside. Immediately, the comforting scent of fresh coffee and baked bread enveloped him. Customers sat at cozy tables, engaged in easy conversations, unaware of the heir to Harrington hotels standing among them. Edward's eyes scanned the busy interior until they landed on Sophie, who stood behind the counter carefully pouring coffee into porcelain cups. For a brief moment, Edward hesitated, observing quietly. Sophie moved with graceful efficiency, offering warm smiles to each patron. He found himself smiling involuntarily. She glanced up from her task, her eyes meeting his briefly. A flash of recognition flickered across her face, quickly replaced by confusion. "You," she murmured softly as Edward approached the counter. "Me," he replied with a playful tilt of his head. "What are you doing here?" Sophie's tone was cautious, guarded, but not unwelcoming. "I came to settle my debt," Edward explained, leaning casually against the countertop. Her eyebrows knitted together, puzzled. "What debt?" Edward smiled warmly, his expression genuine. "You paid my bus fare last night. I think it's only fair to repay you." Sophie gave a small, gentle laugh and shook her head, brushing away the loose strand of hair that had fallen from her ponytail. "That was nothing. Honestly, don't worry about it." "Well," Edward persisted lightly, "at least let me buy you a coffee then, just to balance the scales." She considered his offer briefly, studying him with curious eyes before finally nodding. All right, but only because you seem like the stubborn type. I've been accused of worse, Edward replied, feeling strangely comfortable in her presence. Sophie turned and filled 2 cups, placing them carefully between them on the counter. Edward took a cautious sip, nodding appreciatively. Delicious. Have you worked here long? Almost 2 years now, Sophie replied quietly, relaxing slightly. It pays the bills, keeps things going. What about you? Aside from getting stranded, what do you do? Edward hesitated, momentarily considering the implications of the truth. He chose his words carefully. I work in hotels. Sophie tilted her head slightly. Interesting. Any hotel in particular? Edward smiled lightly, avoiding specifics. It's a family business. Sometimes I wonder if I even had a choice. Sophie leaned forward on her elbows, intrigued. Do you like it? He took another sip before answering honestly. I'm not sure anymore. Sometimes I think I chose the easiest path instead of something truly meaningful. Sophie watched him quietly, her expression thoughtful. There was a sincerity about him she hadn't expected. Maybe it's never too late to change your path. Edward smiled softly, meeting her gaze. And you? What path would you choose if you could? She hesitated briefly, then admitted quietly. I'd open my own bakery. Nothing fancy, just a cozy place filled with warmth, fresh bread, pastries, and good coffee. It's been my dream for a long time. Edward's eyes brightened, genuinely impressed. That's wonderful. What's stopping you? Sophie smiled softly, a trace of sadness in her eyes. Reality. Bills, rent, responsibilities. Dreams like that take time and money. He leaned in slightly, his voice warm and encouraging. You seem like someone who can make it happen. Some dreams are worth fighting for. Her expression softened at his words. That's kind of you to say, especially since you don't know me. Sometimes, Edward replied gently. You don't need to know someone well to see their strength. Before Sophie could respond, a co-worker called her attention. Sophie, table 5 needs their order. I've got to go, she murmured apologetically. Edward nodded, watching her walk away. The brief conversation had left him strangely unsettled. He felt a warmth and comfort in her company that was unfamiliar, yet deeply welcome. As Edward prepared to leave, he discreetly left a generous tip and stepped out into the fresh West Haven air. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the streets glistening softly. He took a deep breath, feeling an unexpected determination building inside him. Across the diner, Sophie glanced toward the door, noticing Edward's absence with a slight pang of disappointment. She shook her head lightly, dismissing the thought. Why would she feel disappointed? He was just a stranger, a man she'd helped on impulse. Yet, as she continued working, Sophie found herself looking towards the door more frequently, each time hoping it might open to reveal him again. And, unknown to her, it would. The days that followed developed into a gentle routine. Edward visited Rosie's diner regularly, arriving each morning at the same time. Their conversations grew steadily more familiar, warmth blossoming between them, though Edward continued to evade details about his true identity. One morning, after a particularly busy rush, Sophie wiped down the counter, clearly exhausted. Edward watched her sympathetically, his own coffee now lukewarm. Long morning? He asked softly. Sophie nodded, offering a weary smile. Very, but it's good busy, just tiring. Edward hesitated briefly. I want to show you something, if you have a minute. She looked at him curiously. What is it? He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone to display an image, a beautiful hotel, elegant and imposing, overlooking the sea. This is one of the places my family owns. Sophie's eyes widened in surprise. Your family owns this? Yes, Edward admitted carefully. I've helped run it most of my adult life. But lately I'm realizing luxury isn't everything. She studied the image quietly, impressed yet thoughtful. Then what are you looking for? Edward met her gaze, sincerity evident in his eyes. Something real, something simple. Sophie's heart fluttered unexpectedly. And have you found it? He smiled faintly, warmth radiating from his eyes. I think maybe I have. Their moment was interrupted as another rush of customers arrived and Sophie reluctantly turned away. But something had changed between them, subtly and deeply. Later, as Sophie left the diner for home, she was surprised to see Edward waiting outside, leaning against a modest but luxurious car. He straightened as she approached, smiling warmly. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly, amused yet cautious. "Offering you a ride home," Edward replied gently. Sophie hesitated briefly, but something in his eyes convinced her. She sighed lightly and smiled. "All right, but only because my feet are killing me." As they drove quietly through West Haven's twilight, Sophie glanced at Edward curiously. "Why do I feel like there's something you're not telling me?" Edward sighed softly, his voice sincere. "Maybe because there is. But sometimes we hide parts of ourselves out of fear." "Fear of what?" Sophie asked quietly. Edward hesitated, glancing at her with vulnerability. "Being judged?" She looked at him intently. "By me?" Edward smiled faintly. "Maybe." "Then," Sophie whispered gently, "I promise not to judge. But someday soon, you'll have to trust me." Edward's smile widened slightly. "I think I can do that." When they arrived at her home, Sophie opened the door slowly. Before stepping out, she turned to Edward, eyes gentle yet firm. "You know, whatever it is you're afraid to share, it won't change how I see you." Edward nodded softly, profoundly moved by her sincerity. "Thank you, Sophie." She smiled warmly and closed the door, walking up the steps to her modest home. As Edward watched her enter, he felt a deep sense of peace and hope. He had found something real, something worth protecting. But the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. Over the following weeks, Edward's morning visits to Rosie's diner became as natural as breathing. Each day, Sophie found herself eagerly anticipating the bell's chime above the door, signaling his arrival. They shared conversations about dreams, simple joys, and life's challenges, though Edward carefully navigated around any direct mention of his immense wealth or family responsibilities. Yet, as comfortable as they grew together, a shadow of uncertainty lingered. Sophie felt Edward's secrecy, sensed the careful omissions he made whenever she approached topics he clearly wished to avoid. Despite her promise not to judge him, Sophie couldn't silence the gentle, insistent voice whispering that something didn't quite add up. Late one afternoon, after a particularly busy shift, Sophie stepped onto the bustling sidewalk, drawing in the cool, fresh air of the West Haven evening. She stretched slightly, easing tired muscles before beginning her usual walk to the bus stop. Lost briefly in thought, Sophie almost missed the familiar silhouette stepping gracefully out of a glossy limousine parked discreetly along the curb. She paused mid-step, eyes widening as her pulse quickened. "Edward?" It was unmistakably him, but dressed impeccably in a tailored dark suit that contrasted sharply with the simple casual attire she'd grown accustomed to seeing. A tall, serious-looking man in a business suit stood beside him, talking earnestly, documents in hand. Edward's demeanor was confident, composed, far removed from the vulnerable man who'd stood awkwardly at her bus stop only weeks ago. Sophie's chest tightened painfully. It suddenly felt as though she were watching a stranger. Questions spun dizzyingly in her mind. Was everything he had shared with her just a facade? Why would someone with such obvious wealth spend his mornings in a humble diner? What was Edward hiding? Her stomach churned with hurt and confusion. Suddenly aware she had stopped in plain view, Sophie hurriedly stepped back, blending into the crowd and hurrying away. Her heart pounded as disappointment and betrayal mixed with a confusing sense of loss. Back at home, Sophie sank onto her sofa, unable to shake the heavy feeling in her chest. She remembered Edward's earnest gaze, his genuine smiles, their easy conversations, and then contrasted that with the wealthy, polished stranger she'd witnessed exiting that limousine. Why hadn't he trusted her enough to reveal the truth? The following morning, Sophie stood quietly behind the diner counter, restless and withdrawn. Every chime of the bell made her heart jump, but Edward didn't appear at his usual hour. She felt strangely hollow, the diner seeming quieter, duller in his absence. "Everything okay, Sophie?" her co-worker Jenny asked gently, noticing Sophie's unusual silence. "I'm fine," Sophie murmured softly, forcing a weak smile, but Jenny's concerned glance made it clear she wasn't convincing. The morning dragged on slowly, the diner gradually emptying until the lunch rush began. As Sophie mechanically wiped down tables, a sudden murmur from the diner's television drew her attention. Edward Harrington, heir to Harrington Hotels, seen last night at an exclusive charity gala in downtown West Haven. Sources indicate that he is poised to take over leadership of the Harrington Empire from his father in the coming months. Sophie froze, her breath catching painfully in her chest. On screen, Edward stood impeccably dressed in an expensive tuxedo, surrounded by reporters and photographers, confidently smiling, the Edward she never knew existed. "Sophie, you all right?" Jenny's voice sounded distant as Sophie numbly untied her apron, feeling a quiet anger rising within her. "I need some air," she murmured, stepping quickly out of the diner. Her steps quickened into a brisk walk, heart racing, pulse pounding in her ears. She needed answers, and only one person could provide them. The sleek, towering Harrington Hotel loomed over Sophie as she approached, feeling overwhelmingly small beneath its intimidating luxury. Security eyed her skeptically as she neared the entrance. "Can I help you?" one guard questioned firmly. "I'm here to see Edward Harrington," Sophie responded evenly, voice trembling only slightly. The guard hesitated, clearly suspicious. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but please tell him Sophie Carter is here," she insisted gently. "He knows me." After a brief skeptical pause, the guard spoke quietly into his radio. Moments later, with obvious surprise, he stepped aside and gestured Sophie toward the lobby entrance. Her heart pounded fiercely as she entered the lavish interior, marble floors shining beneath crystal chandeliers. Edward appeared moments later, descending the grand staircase, his expression shifting from confusion to anxiety. "Sophie, what's going on?" His voice betrayed a subtle tension. Sophie folded her arms tightly, struggling to steady her trembling voice. "I saw you on TV. Harrington Hotels. Edward Harrington. Is that really who you are?" Edward's eyes widened slightly, realization dawning heavily upon him. He nodded slowly, softly sighing. "Yes, that's my family." She shook her head slowly, feeling tears sting her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me? I trusted you." Edward stepped closer, his voice gentle, pleading. "I didn't want my name or money influencing our friendship. With you, I felt like someone finally saw the real me." Sophie drew back sharply. "But it wasn't real, was it? You created this version of yourself, someone approachable, relatable, but it wasn't the whole truth." Edward reached out instinctively, stopping as Sophie flinched slightly. "I was afraid you'd see me differently." "Well," Sophie whispered bitterly, "you succeeded." "Sophie, please," Edward began. "No." Sophie cut him off, her voice trembling with hurt and anger. "I opened up to you, shared my dreams, my fears, everything, and you couldn't trust me enough to be honest about who you really are." Edward looked desperate. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," Sophie interrupted, stepping back toward the door. "I need time. I need to think. Please, don't follow me." Edward stood silently, helplessly, watching as Sophie turned away and walked out of his world, taking the warmth she'd brought with her. That evening, Sophie sat quietly on her porch, staring numbly at the darkening sky. Her mother, sensing her distress, sat quietly beside her. "Sweetheart," her mother murmured softly. "What happened?" Sophie sighed shakily, fighting tears. I thought I knew him, but he hid things, important things. Her mother gently squeezed her hand. Maybe he was afraid. People often hide parts of themselves because they're scared. But, Sophie whispered brokenly, what if that fear destroyed something special? Her mother offered a quiet, comforting smile. Then the only question left is, can you forgive him? Sophie remained silent, staring out into the quiet night, uncertain how to answer that painful question. Across the city, Edward stood alone in his luxurious penthouse, staring out over West Haven's shimmering lights, feeling unbearably empty. He had everything money could buy, but he'd lost something irreplaceable. He knew he had only one option, to risk everything, to step away from the Harrington name and show Sophie that she mattered more than all the wealth in the world, and he hoped desperately that it wouldn't be too late. Edward stared out at West Haven's skyline, the twinkling lights blurred by his troubled gaze. The luxurious penthouse, typically comforting, felt suffocatingly empty. In his mind echoed Sophie's wounded words, her hurt-filled eyes etched deeply into his memory. He knew he had betrayed her trust, not through malice but through fear. Yet the reason didn't matter. He'd hurt her all the same, and that knowledge ate at him relentlessly. He needed to fix this, but to do so meant taking a risk larger than any he'd faced before. The next morning, determination settled firmly in Edward's chest as he walked confidently into the Harrington Hotel's boardroom. His father, Richard Harrington, a commanding figure known for his iron will, stood at the head of the expansive table, eyebrows raised in slight surprise at Edward's early arrival. "Edward," his father acknowledged, a trace of suspicion in his voice. "You're here early." Edward took a steadying breath, meeting his father's gaze without hesitation. "We need to talk." Richard narrowed his eyes slightly. "About?" Edward squared his shoulders, steeling himself against decades of expectation and tradition. "My resignation." A heavy silence enveloped the room. Richard stared incredulously, expression hardening. "What kind of joke is this?" "No joke," Edward replied calmly, clearly resolved. "I'm stepping down from Harrington Hotels, effective immediately." Richard stepped forward, voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Have you completely lost your mind? You're about to inherit one of the largest empires in the country." Edward shook his head firmly. "I never chose this. I've been living your dream, not mine. It's time I lived my own life." Richard's jaw clenched, eyes blazing with disbelief. "All this, for some waitress?" Edward's eyes darkened, voice low but unwavering. "This isn't about Sophie. It's about me finally choosing authenticity over status. But yes, she showed me what genuine strength and kindness look like." His father's voice dripped with contempt. "You'd give up everything we built, everything your mother and I sacrificed for a stranger?" Edward held firm. "Yes, because for the first time, I've seen clearly what truly matters." Without waiting for further argument, Edward placed his resignation letter gently on the polished mahogany table, turned quietly, and walked out, leaving behind the stunned silence of a life he'd never fully chosen. Across West Haven, Sophie struggled through her shift at Rosie's, unable to shake the ache lingering heavily in her chest. Edward's absence at the diner was a painful reminder of how deeply he'd integrated himself into her routine, her heart, and her dreams. "Sophie, turn up the TV," Jenny called, her voice edged with excitement. Confused, Sophie glanced up at the diner's small television, pulse quickening as Edward's familiar face appeared once again. "Breaking news from West Haven today," the reporter began. Edward Harrington, the heir to the Harrington Hotel fortune, stunned the business world by announcing his immediate resignation. Sources say he plans to step away from the Harrington empire to pursue his own path, away from the shadow of his family's fortune. Sophie felt her heart race painfully. Edward resigned? Had he really left everything behind? Her mind swirled with confusion, uncertainty, and a fragile sense of hope. Had he done this because of her? Could she believe it? The days passed quietly. Edward respected Sophie's need for space, even as his own heart ached painfully. He busied himself laying groundwork for a new future, fueled by purpose and honesty. Still, every thought led inevitably back to Sophie. Late one evening, his phone vibrated unexpectedly. His pulse quickened sharply as he recognized Sophie's name on the screen. "We need to talk." Edward's hands trembled slightly as he typed his reply. "Tell me where and when." Her response was brief but clear. "Tomorrow at the cafe by Riverside Park, noon." Edward arrived early, seated nervously by the window of the quiet cafe overlooking the river. When Sophie entered moments later, his breath caught painfully. She sat across from him, expression cautious but less guarded than before. For a long, heavy moment, neither spoke. Finally, Sophie broke the silence, her voice gentle but resolute. "Did you resign for me, Edward?" Edward hesitated only briefly before shaking his head gently. "Not just for you, for myself. I needed to prove I can be more than my last name." Sophie studied him carefully, searching for sincerity. "And what happens now?" Edward leaned forward earnestly. "I want to build something real, on my own terms, something meaningful." She swallowed softly, hesitant, yet hopeful. "What about us?" Edward met her gaze steadily, raw honesty in his voice. "I never intended to hurt you. I hid who I was because I feared you'd see only my wealth, not me. But I realize now trust can't exist without honesty. I want us to start over, completely open. No more secrets." Sophie considered silently, her heart beating unsteadily. "I want to believe you, but trust takes time." Edward nodded sincerely. "Then let's take that time. I'll show you I'm serious." Sophie smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting quiet warmth. "Okay, but let's start slow. I need to be sure this time." Edward smiled gently, relief flooding his expression. "However long it takes." As weeks passed, they cautiously rebuilt their relationship. Sophie saw Edward's transformation firsthand. No longer the guarded, uncertain man hiding behind his privilege. He had become open, vulnerable, committed to creating something genuine. One peaceful evening by the riverbank, Edward took Sophie's hand gently. "Do you still dream of opening your bakery?" Sophie smiled softly, nodding. "Always." Edward squeezed her hand warmly. "I have a proposition. I'm opening a small hotel in Bayview. Something personal and intimate. There's space inside for your bakery." Sophie's eyes widened with surprise, her pulse quickening. "You're serious?" Edward's gaze was tender, genuine. "Completely. I can't imagine anyone else I'd rather build a dream alongside." Emotion overwhelmed Sophie, and tears shimmered gently in her eyes. "It sounds beautiful." Edward smiled warmly, whispering softly, "Then let's make it real, together." Months later, construction began on their dream. Each brick laid, each paint color chosen symbolized trust painstakingly rebuilt. Sophie and Edward grew closer, their bond now strong, resilient, founded upon honesty and mutual respect. Yet as they stood admiring their nearly completed hotel and bakery, Edward's phone vibrated sharply, breaking the moment. He hesitated briefly before answering, expression tightening instantly, as a familiar voice spoke coldly. "Edward." His father's voice was low, firm. "We need to talk. Immediately." Edward's stomach tightened uneasily, his eyes briefly meeting Sophie's worried gaze. He whispered softly into the phone, voice steady yet strained. "I'll meet you, but nothing you say can change my mind." Ending the call, he turned to Sophie, determination clashing with quiet anxiety in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Sophie asked softly, sensing his tension immediately. "My father." Edward sighed quietly, voice heavy with unresolved tension. "He's not done fighting me on this." She gently squeezed his hand, eyes reassuring despite worry. "You're stronger than his expectations, Edward. Remember that." Edward nodded firmly, her quiet strength bolstering his courage. "I won't let him destroy what we're building." Yet as they stood silently together, the gentle sea breeze carrying the scent of new beginnings, Edward felt a quiet, lingering fear. He'd faced down his father once, but he knew deep down, Richard Harrington wasn't finished testing him yet. Edward stood motionless outside his father's office in the imposing headquarters of Harrington Hotels. He could feel the familiar weight of expectation pressing down on him, the walls lined with framed photographs and commendations. a gallery of the family's carefully maintained empire. He inhaled sharply, steadying himself before pushing open the heavy oak doors. Richard Harrington sat behind a polished desk, posture rigid, his gaze coldly assessing. The tension in the room was palpable, thick and heavy like the gathering storm visible through the towering windows. "Sit down," Richard commanded, his voice void of warmth. Edward remained standing, defiant yet calm. "I prefer to stand." Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the hint of frustration evident. "Do you understand what you're doing, Edward? The Harrington name took generations to build. You're throwing it away on a whim." Edward's voice was quiet but unwavering. "It's not a whim. It's my life. For once, I'm choosing my own direction." His father's eyes darkened with anger. "This girl, Sophie, is she worth sacrificing everything? The business, your inheritance, your family?" Edward met his father's piercing gaze steadily, refusing to waver. "This isn't just about Sophie. It's about finally living honestly. She showed me what integrity means, something you seem to have forgotten." Richard stood abruptly, voice raised slightly. "Integrity? I've built our family's legacy. I gave you opportunities others can only dream of." "You built your legacy," Edward replied calmly, voice edged with quiet resolve. "You chose my life before I had the chance. This hotel empire is your dream, not mine." Richard's face contorted briefly, struggling to control his fury. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." Edward shook his head gently, sadness and determination mingling in his eyes. "The only mistake I made was not having the courage to do this sooner." His father's voice lowered dangerously. "If you walk away, there's no coming back. No safety net. You're on your own." Edward smiled softly, confidently, speaking quietly. "Good. It's about time." He turned without another word, leaving his father standing speechless in the silence of his once unquestioned authority. Stepping outside, Edward felt lighter, as though shedding a lifetime's burden. But he knew the battle wasn't entirely behind him. Not yet. Across town, Sophie arranged freshly baked pastries on trays, her movements slowed by an uneasy anxiety gnawing at her. Her thoughts constantly drifted back to Edward and the difficult meeting with his father. She trusted Edward, but his family's influence loomed heavily. "Sophie," Jenny called gently, interrupting her thoughts. "Someone's here to see you." Turning swiftly, Sophie found herself face to face with Edward's mother, Eleanor Harrington. The older woman stood quietly, impeccably dressed, but with a softer demeanor than Richard's stern facade. "Mrs. Harrington," Sophie murmured nervously, uncertain what to expect. Eleanor smiled gently, eyes warm yet tinged with sadness. "Please, call me Eleanor. Can we talk?" Sophie nodded hesitantly, guiding Eleanor to a quiet corner booth. Sitting quietly, Sophie waited for Eleanor to speak first. "Edward adores you," Eleanor began softly, sincere kindness evident. "I've never seen him happier or more certain about anything." Sophie relaxed slightly, her heart fluttering gently. "I feel the same." Eleanor's expression clouded slightly. "My husband won't accept this easily. He sees Edward's independence as a betrayal, a rejection of our family legacy." Sophie's chest tightened anxiously. "I never wanted to cause trouble between them." Eleanor shook her head reassuringly. "It's not your fault. Edward's father needs to understand this decision isn't rebellion. It's maturity. It takes strength to choose happiness over duty." "Can he?" Sophie asked softly, eyes vulnerable. "Will Richard Harrington ever accept Edward's choice?" Eleanor sighed gently, meeting Sophie's gaze earnestly. "Not easily. But I'm hopeful he'll see Edward's courage eventually. Until then, please don't give up on him." Sophie smiled warmly, touched by Eleanor's sincerity. "I won't." Eleanor rose gracefully, gently squeezing Sophie's hand. "Thank you. Take care of each other." Watching Eleanor leave, Sophie felt renewed determination. She and Edward had faced challenges already, but more lay ahead. Together, they'd face them head on. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations as Edward and Sophie worked diligently on their shared dream. The coastal town of Bayview soon buzzed with excitement over the intimate hotel and bakery taking shape along its quiet shoreline. Residents watched curiously, intrigued by the elegant but understated building growing before their eyes. One crisp autumn afternoon, Edward found Sophie carefully arranging flower boxes along the bakery windows. Approaching quietly, he gently touched her shoulder. "Can I steal you away for a moment?" Edward's voice was playful, a soft sparkle in his eyes. Sophie raised an eyebrow teasingly. "Shouldn't you be supervising the hotel lobby?" He laughed warmly, leading her gently toward the nearby beach. They walked slowly along the shoreline, waves gently lapping the sand, a calming rhythm beneath their conversation. "Sophie," Edward spoke softly, sincerity clear in his voice. "I wanted to ask you something important." Her pulse quickened, heart racing as she met his earnest gaze. "What is it?" He paused, reaching into his pocket to reveal a small velvet box. Sophie's eyes widened, breath catching softly as Edward opened it to reveal a delicate, shimmering diamond ring. "Sophie, you've changed my life in every possible way," he murmured softly, his voice tender with emotion. "You showed me what true kindness, honesty, and love can be. I can't imagine a future without you. Will you marry me?" Sophie felt tears gathering gently, warmth spreading through her chest. She nodded immediately, her voice choked with happiness. "Yes, Edward. Of course I will." He smiled radiantly, slipping the ring gently onto her finger, pulling her close as they kissed softly beneath the warm sunlight, the gentle waves applauding softly behind them. As news spread throughout Bayview and back to West Haven, their impending marriage became the quiet talk of the town. For Sophie and Edward, each day brought happiness and excitement, tempered by lingering family tensions. Yet despite their joy, shadows of the past still lingered. One afternoon, Sophie's phone buzzed sharply, interrupting her quiet moment of baking. Seeing an unfamiliar number, she hesitated briefly before answering. "Sophie?" A familiar, unwelcome voice spoke clearly through the receiver. Her heart froze instantly. "Jake?" she whispered, her breath catching painfully. Her ex-boyfriend's voice was as smooth as she remembered, carrying an underlying menace. "I heard you're doing well, Sophie. Congratulations on the new place and the engagement." "What do you want?" Sophie asked warily, her pulse racing. "Just thought you want to know. I'm back in town," Jake replied softly, voice tinged with barely concealed intent. "Maybe we should catch up." "I don't think so." Sophie's voice hardened immediately. "Leave me alone." Jake's chuckle echoed coldly in her ear. "We'll see, Sophie. You know I don't give up easily." He ended the call abruptly, leaving Sophie trembling, her sense of security suddenly fractured. The past she had fought so hard to leave behind threatened to destroy the peace she'd finally found. That evening, Edward instantly sensed Sophie's unease. Gently, he took her hands, concern evident in his eyes. "Sophie, what's wrong?" Edward's voice was softly protective. Her eyes met his anxiously, voice trembling slightly. "Jake called. He's back." Edward's expression darkened protectively. "He won't hurt you again, I promise." Sophie leaned into him, drawing strength from his comforting presence. "I know, but he's unpredictable." Edward held her tightly, voice calm but resolute. "Together, we're stronger than anyone's threats. Whatever Jake tries, he won't succeed. Our past doesn't define us. Our future does." She nodded softly, feeling reassured yet quietly apprehensive. They'd faced family challenges, misunderstandings, and difficult decisions, but now a darker challenge loomed, testing their newfound strength. Yet Sophie was certain of one thing. With Edward at her side, no darkness could break them. The golden morning sun poured over Bayview's cobbled streets as final touches were made to the Harrington Inn and Sophie's bakery, the flower window. The grand opening was days away, and though the scent of fresh paint still lingered in the air, the inn and cafe pulsed with life. Inside the bakery, Sophie stood near the polished wooden counter, laying out her test batch of cinnamon rolls. Flour dusted her apron and cheeks, and her hair was tied back in a messy bun. She looked radiant, not just from the glow of the morning light, but from the anticipation in her heart. Everything she had ever dreamed of was right here. Edward appeared at the door, his sleeves rolled to his elbows and a clipboard tucked under one arm. "You've made this place smell like heaven," he teased, walking in and stealing a bite of a still warm pastry. Sophie smiled, shaking her head. "That's the third one you've tested today. I'm doing it for quality control," he said with a wink. They shared a quiet laugh, a moment of lightness amid the pressure of looming deadlines. Yet beneath Sophie's smile, unease lingered. Jake's call still echoed in the corners of her mind, a reminder that shadows from her past were drawing near. Edward noticed the flicker of tension in her eyes. He set the clipboard down and walked closer. "Has he called again?" She shook her head. "No, but I keep looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's watching." Edward pulled her into his arms gently. "Whatever happens, I'm right here, and we're not going to let him ruin what we've built." Sophie nodded, resting her head against his chest. "Promise me we'll face it together." "I promise," he whispered. 2 days before the opening, the bakery and hotel were buzzing with preparation. Sophie was organizing deliveries and finalizing the menu, while Edward was coordinating with staff and contractors. The energy in Bayview was contagious, residents were excited, local papers had written glowing previews, and pre-bookings for the inn were already rolling in. But trouble wasn't far behind. That evening, Edward returned from a quick run to the hardware store and found Sophie pale and shaken. A small box sat on the bakery counter, unmarked, crudely taped. Inside was a single burnt pastry and a note. "Sweet dreams don't last forever, Jay." Edward's jaw clenched as he picked up the note. "He was here?" Sophie nodded. "I didn't see him. The box was just there when I came back from the storeroom." Edward's fists tightened. "He's trying to scare you." She looked up, eyes full of quiet fear. "It's working." Edward took her hand. "Then it's time we stop letting him hide in the shadows." The next morning, Edward met with the local police. Though Jake hadn't made any physical threats, the officer agreed to assign a patrol car near the hotel during opening week. Still, Edward didn't feel that was enough. He contacted a private security firm and hired 2 plainclothes guards to discreetly monitor the premises. Sophie didn't argue. She knew Jake's unpredictability, and she trusted Edward to protect them both. That night, as they locked up the bakery, Sophie stood under the stars, gazing out at the peaceful coastline. "I never thought I'd live to see this dream," she murmured. "And now, it feels like someone's trying to snatch it away." Edward came beside her, placing a gentle hand on her back. "Then let's not let go of it, not even for a second." She turned to him, a voice barely above a whisper. "If anything happens, I want you to know something." Edward's eyes searched hers. "What?" "I love you, no matter what." He leaned forward, brushing his lips gently against her forehead. "And I love you. I've never been more certain of anything." On the morning of the grand opening, the town of Bayview came alive. Streamers danced in the breeze, music played softly from speakers outside, and a crowd gathered in anticipation. Local reporters arrived early, snapping pictures of the sparkling sign above the door, Harrington Inn, the flower window. Edward stood in a crisp navy suit, greeting guests with warm handshakes. Sophie, in a soft lilac dress and apron, moved between the bakery and the front steps, her smile radiant even as she kept a quiet eye out for trouble. By noon, the bakery was packed with eager customers. The cinnamon rolls were a hit, and Sophie barely kept up with the orders. Edward peeked in every few minutes, unable to hide the pride on his face. But just as things were reaching their peak, Sophie caught a figure standing across the street. Jake. He leaned against a lamppost, watching the bakery intently. He wasn't trying to hide. He wanted her to see him. Her heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. She wiped her hands calmly, untied her apron, and stepped outside. Jake smirked as she approached. "Big day, huh?" "What do you want, Jake?" she asked, her voice cool and steady. He shrugged. "Just came to see the place." You've done well for yourself. Sophie didn't blink. You said what you came to say with that box, so say the rest now or leave. Jake's face tightened. He'll leave you, you know. Guys like him always do. They get bored. Sophie crossed her arms. That's where you're wrong. Edward doesn't lie. He doesn't control. He doesn't threaten. You're a ghost, Jake, one I've put behind me. Jake's eyes narrowed, but before he could reply, Edward appeared at Sophie's side, calm but firm. She's not alone, Edward said quietly. Not anymore. Jake scoffed. So you're her knight now? Edward didn't rise to the bait. I'm the man who loves her, and if you come near her again, I'll make sure the law handles it, quickly and permanently. Jake held their stare a beat longer, then smirked coldly and turned away, vanishing down the street. Sophie exhaled, the tension in her body releasing all at once. Edward looked at her, hand brushing her cheek. Are you okay? She nodded slowly, tears of relief welling in her eyes. I didn't run this time. Edward smiled. No, you stood taller than I've ever seen. That night, the opening ended with fireworks over the beach and laughter echoing from the inn's balconies. Guests lingered by the cafe, sipping warm drinks and enjoying the comfort of a dream finally brought to life. Sophie stood at the edge of the sand, barefoot, her dress brushing the shoreline. Edward came behind her, arms wrapping around her waist. We did it, she whispered. He kissed her temple. Yes, and no one, no fear, no past, can take it from us. Sophie closed her eyes, finally at peace. The soft waves lapped against the Bayview shoreline as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting streaks of orange and rose across the ocean. It had been 3 months since the grand opening of the Flower Window in Harrington Inn, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt like a dream finally realized. Sophie woke every morning before sunrise to knead dough and fill the bakery with the smell of cinnamon, coffee, and fresh bread. Edward, now free from the demands of the Harrington Empire, spent his days managing their boutique inn, greeting guests, and savoring a life he had once believed was impossible for someone like him. And now, he was ready to take the final step. It began with a note. Sophie found it taped to the espresso machine one morning, written in Edward's familiar, careful handwriting. Today don't wear flower. Wear the lilac dress, and meet me at the old lighthouse at 5 p.m. She smiled, brushing her fingers across the paper. Her heart thumped with anticipation. Edward had always been thoughtful, but this note felt different. Intimate. Intentional. At exactly 5 p.m., Sophie walked slowly toward the lighthouse cliff. The wind teased at her curls, and her lilac dress moved gently with the sea breeze. As she reached the top, she froze. A small table had been set beneath the lighthouse balcony, lit by golden string lights. A violinist played softly in the background, and beside the table Edward stood, tall, proud, nervous, and holding a single white rose. Sophie laughed gently, eyes shimmering with tears. You've outdone yourself. Edward stepped forward, offering the rose. I wanted you to remember this night forever. I already will, she whispered. They ate under the softening sky, laughing, holding hands across the table, watching the sun begin its descent. And then, just as the last light touched the horizon, Edward stood and walked around to her side. He lowered himself to one knee. Sophie gasped. Edward held up a delicate silver ring set with a glistening stone that sparkled like the ocean. His voice shook with emotion. Sophie Carter, I once thought my life would be dictated by others. Then you walked in, with nothing but a bus fare and a heart too big for this world. You saved me in ways I didn't even understand back then. You gave me purpose. You gave me love. Will you be my wife? Tears slid down Sophie's cheeks as she nodded quickly. Yes, of course. Edward slid the ring onto her finger, and the lighthouse behind them glowed faintly as the stars blinked to life above. They held each other close, swaying gently to the music and the rhythm of waves below. The wedding planning swept through Bayview like a warm breeze. The entire town seemed to join in. Locals offered decorations, musicians volunteered, the florist insisted on arranging flowers for free. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a celebration of love the whole community had watched blossom. They chose the beach behind the inn for the ceremony. A simple white arch, rows of white wooden chairs, lavender ribbons fluttering in the breeze, barefoot guests, smiling neighbors, and a sea of white petals strewn on the sand. On the day, Sophie stood before the mirror in her room, dressed in a flowing off-shoulder gown with delicate lace at the sleeves. Her mother gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "You look like the kind of woman who built her life with her own hands," she whispered. Sophie smiled. "Because I did." When she stepped onto the beach, Edward stood waiting at the altar in a cream linen suit, barefoot in the sand, eyes filled with awe. As she walked toward him, her heart felt like it might burst, not with fear, but with certainty. Their vows were simple, honest, and tear-filled. "I loved you the moment you paid for my bus fare," Edward said. "But I didn't understand it then. I understand now. It wasn't the money. It was your heart, your strength, your grace. I vow to protect that heart with mine every day." Sophie held his hands tightly. "I loved you before I knew who you were. And after I did, I had to love you all over again, deeper, clearer, stronger. I promised to stand by you in storms and stillness. I promised to be your home." The officiant smiled through misty eyes. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Edward pulled Sophie into his arms, their kiss met by the ocean's roar and thunderous applause. It was done. They were one. That night, under stars and fairy lights, their first dance played on the patio behind the bakery. Guests swayed to music, champagne sparkled in flutes, and the scent of warm pastries drifted from the kitchen. Edward and Sophie danced slowly, forehead to forehead, no longer afraid of the future, until a stranger arrived. He stood just beyond the lights, watching quietly. His suit was sharp, his posture commanding, an envelope in hand. Edward noticed him first. "Do you know that man?" he asked Sophie softly. She turned. Her heart skipped. "No," she said slowly. "But something about him." The man stepped forward, stopping at the edge of the dance floor. A waiter tried to intervene, but he held up the envelope calmly. "This is for you," he said, handing it to Edward. Edward took it, confused. "Who sent you?" "I wasn't sent," the man replied. "I'm your brother." Silence fell. Edward stared. "I don't have a brother." The man smiled faintly. "You do now. We need to talk." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the dark. Sophie's hand slipped into Edward's. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside, one line in bold handwriting. "There are things your father never told you."